Hey, my name is Erin, and this is my channel, Dr. Rinnerung, and this is where I talk about sort of things related to my teaching and popular culture and my research. And today I am super excited because for this conversation, I have David from Four Corners of the Page. And so before we jump into things, I'm going to get him to introduce himself and give us a little bit about his channel as well.
Okay, well, welcome to the grayest YouTube background you'll ever see in your life. We were just talking about how we can adjust my light to give it some semblance of color. But I'm very happy to be here. My name is David from Four Corners of the Page. I started my channel, I guess, back in January, just to kind of have an outlet to talk about books. A lot of that is Malazan, not as much as I'd like, but I do have plans to do more going forward. Although always, and I don't know if you feel the same, Erin, I feel like I have to start a Malazan video with an expression of my own inadequacy because I'm aware that there are absolute encyclopedias, who just have Malazan memorized cover to cover. And although I really greatly enjoy the series, I might make one or two slip-ups. If I do, you'll have to forgive me on that, but I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, well, no, I'm definitely the same. And if you spend
Mhm.
any time on Reddit, you know there are encyclopedias out there,
Yeah,
but
it's
my
crazy.
memory is not really up to that, as much as I love the books and enjoy reading and rereading them. So yeah, we will be gentle with both of us if there are mistakes. And always, of course, that's what the comments are for. Feel free to
Mhm.
correct us if there's something you notice. Certainly. So for this video, I've been wanting to do this for a while, and this, I will sort of say first that there's spoilers probably for the whole sort of Big Ten of Erikson's series. And this started with me wanting to talk about Paran, and it turned into me wanting to really talk about just heroes and the heroic in the series. And it was really inspired by a moment in Memory's Vice that I want to sort of point to and like start us off with that because it's this wonderful meta moment, which we Erikson does that a lot of times throughout the series, which is really great. But when, Perrin's resisting his master of the deck role in a conversation with Silver Fox, he says, you set me for a quest. Really, Silver Fox? Aimless, purposeless men do not undertake quests. That's for wall-eyed heroes in epic poems, right? So this idea that even Perrin himself is aware of this strange relationship to the genre he's within, but
Mhm.
also resisting it, which is one of the reasons I sort of really liked him as a character, to start with thinking about heroes. So I think starting with what we mean by hero would be most useful. And before maybe I get into the actual definitions that I looked up, because, of course, as someone who teaches, I have to always go back to the books and see what the critics are saying. But maybe actually we could chat first a bit about just our own, just from reading fantasy, right? What our
Mhm.
impressions are of what constitutes a hero in a fantasy text specifically. I don't know if you can throw that to you, David.
Well, the reason I was doing this, I don't know if you saw that, is I'm currently also looking at a massive Google Doc that I have to one side. So forgive me if I look like I'm texting someone. But I actually had this written down too, because I thought it was really important to list the characteristics of a hero because, you probably agree with this as well. Often we use the word hero as interchangeable with protagonist. And they're not necessarily the same. There is difference there. The main character might or might not be a hero. A hero might or not be the main character. So it is important to kind of unbraid some of these things that we associate. One of the things I have written down, I think one of the main things is generally speaking, morally virtuous. I think that often comes up if we're going to talk about hero versus anti-hero versus tragic hero versus antagonist. If we're taking that first word hero, there generally has to be a sense of kind of morality about them. Um, they have to be, generally speaking, quite idealistic, I would say as well. They are willing to follow their moral code through to completion. And there also, I would say, just to add one more to get the conversation going, there often has to be a sense of maybe, is sacrificiality a word? It sounds like it's a word. They have to be willing to
Sacrifice.
yeah, they have to sacrifice or be willing to sacrifice something, I would argue, to be what we would generally call in fantasy a hero. I don't know if you'd agree or throw anything more out there.
I would agree, but I'd also throw some more out there in the
Yeah.
sense that, so you're right, it's actually really interesting in the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms actually uses hero in that very generic sense as the main
Mhm.
character of a story, but they also specify right in that definition that protagonist is preferred, right, as a
Yes.
term, right, because it's a more neutral term and hero brings these other qualities. Um, and it's funny because many fantasy companions, like I was looking it up in the Encyclopedia of Fantasy that Jean-Claude and John Grant, I think is the other person who did it, but this is from a while ago, but it's a fun reference text. But it's so strange because that one, they don't really give you a definition. It's sort of circular. They say, a hero in a fantasy text has heroic qualities.
Hmm.
Like, okay, but what are heroic qualities, right? So it's a
Yeah.
strange idea. And I think what you're saying is true, right? We think of it, it's associated with an earlier era of like epic, like verse, basically, like that sort of idea, that tradition. And it is about sacrifice. It's about sort of a moral goodness. It's about sort of preferring the good of the world over the self, right? In
Hmm.
many ways. There's a recent critic I love that I want to mention, Palmer-Patel. She's did a book on the structure of epic fantasy in particular, like heroic epic fantasy. And one of the things she plays with in that is, and this is very interesting to me, is that there's that element of destiny, right? So a
Mm.
hero almost is destined to have this impact on the world in some way. So they realizes this and they have this sort of journey. But for her, and I don't know how I feel about this, but I think Erikson's playing with it, which is why it's interesting, is that there's agency, right? Like this hero is choosing to do this to save the world. So it's like they know their destiny, they know their duty, and they're fulfilling it, right? And they have this sense of their place in the wider universe, and they're doing it of their own free will. Like for her, free will is really important, which I find fascinating for our text, especially with regard to Paran.
What was the name of the book that you were reading? I'd love to follow up
It'll
with
be
that.
below, but yeah, it's The Shape of Fantasy by C. Palmer-Patel.
Hmm.
And it is an academic text, but very readable if you're into epic fantasy.
It is. I think as you were speaking, I mean, two points were coming to mind. I mean, first, I think the idea of kind of interacting with the world and saving the world potentially, and realizing the worth of the world. It's also, I think, with traditional heroes and maybe even classic heroes that the the hero in question gains knowledge of the world as they are willing to sacrifice more and more from it. I mean, we have that in fantasy, especially Harry Potter, Frodo Baggins. They have to uncover what the world is before they're potentially willing to take that final leap. But the other thing that I was thinking of as you were talking is the text in question, and especially Paran, because you have this on the one hand idea of destiny, and in Malazan, very often what happens is that the characters have their destiny given to them by an how can we call the gods in Malazan, the theological pantheon, because
You know,
one of them gives destiny to a character, and very often the characters very carefully consider whether they want that destiny or not. And in the case of Paran, first of all, he, and in Gardens of the Moon, there's the question of the coin and the twins and what's going on there, especially with Crocus as well. But then
yeah,
in Memories of Ice, what happens? I think the Azath House decides that Paran is going to be forgive me, what's the name? The Master of the Deck.
Master of the
That is
Deck.
that is
Yeah.
given to him as a thing that he has to contend with, and he spends a lot of time deciding whether he wants that role or not, and what he's going to do with it. So I really enjoyed what you were saying.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love that about Parrot, and I'll stick there for a second, right?
Yeah.
In that, because the thing about, and I think Erikson is doing something really interesting with this, because certainly knows sort of those classic epic heroes, like is very well versed in particularly
Mhm.
classical epic. And so this idea that Paran is rejecting it at first, right? Like he has no desire to have this role. He does not want to be master of the deck. He does not, such that he's making himself sick, right? So
Mhm.
you have these
Yes.
wonderful moments where like he is actually in like intense pain, and like Quick Ben and Whiskey Jack will have these conversations about it. And it's because he's rejecting this role that's been thrust upon him. And yet he doesn't he doesn't have any choice,
Mm.
right? Like as you say, the Azath House and Raced, I think at some point says this directly, the Azath House has chosen him, and this is just what he is now, just what he has to do. And this sort of continues throughout, because even like later, I think it's in Bone Hunters, I want to say, when he meets up with the Malazan army again, he just gets pushed into the high fist role.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to be necessarily, but it's like, no, you're high fist now, and this is what you're going to do, which I find fascinating because it's I mean, I didn't plan to go to this immediately, but I might as well since we're talking about it. Like, I think one of the things that Paran is doing, or Erikson's doing with Paran, is that like he's a different mode of hero. So there's another mode, and this is controversial, but so someone named Fredric Jameson, he talks about particularly, and this is early modern romance, right? So this is sort of a taproot text for a lot of contemporary fantasy. The heroes there are almost distinguished by their passivity, like people in Spenser's The Faerie Queen or
Mm.
some of Shakespeare's heroes in his romances, where the sense is like destiny works through them, but they have very little control in the matter. They just get sort of buffeted from place to place. So they act as this sort of conduit, but it's not their choice. It's not their agency. It's a very sort
Which
of different style of hero.
which is very interesting as well, thinking about the Fairy Queen, because a lot of the characteristics that are praised in the Fairy Queen are characteristics of absence, like temperance. Temperance is the absence of indulgence. So it's interesting that they are being framed by their passivity when the action they are being lauded for is also passive. It's
Yeah,
really
it's
interesting.
like
Yeah.
it is. It's like Red Cross Knight is a very big example of this, right? In the first book of the Fairy Queen, where he just sort of gets shunted around and sort of manipulated and used, and still is very much the hero. He's a little literal knight, right? Who's off to slay the dragon, if you
Hmm.
will. But like they're important for what they are, but not what they choose. Right. So it's an interesting, I feel like there's a tension there. And I think Erikson's absolutely playing with this with different figures. And we can move into some of different like heroic figures in the series with thinking about this. But he's playing with that tension between the hero who's sort of used by destiny and the hero who chooses what they're doing. Like, so who actively recognizes their role, embraces their role,
Hmm.
and sort of fulfills that. And I think there's examples of both in the series.
I think maybe in one character there's both too, because I think Paran is sometimes passive and sometimes he's active. I mean, the whole sense of kind of the sanctioning of the crippled god into the House of Chains and whether or not he's going to do that. And then obviously in the the very last book in the series, he literally comes down with that army that he's inherited from Dujek One Arm. And there's also a really interesting line when you're talking about Paran inheriting the army from Dujek. I can't remember exactly what the line is, but he basically walks out of that tent and goes, how do you tell an army that their hero has died? Almost as though he is, aware that this is a mantle that has been is cast off through the act of death. Although I think we can also talk about the fact that often people become heroic after they die. But Paran is distinctly aware, I think, of his own actions that he must face or cast off.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
seriously that idea of, and I know we're going to come back to it, but that idea of the brush with death or the becoming hero after death or like even
Mm,
like the journey to the underworld, like all of that
mm,
coming out of epic fantasy, like we get almost wildly early, right, in Gardens of the Moon where Paran dies. And it's like, oh, of course, he's some sort of hero because he dies and comes back, and that's what heroes do.
hmm.
Right? So it's playing, I think, also with that. The fact that it comes so early, I think, is really fun in the book because it's where it's like I think you were talking about this in your video about the prologue, which of course I'll link to Gardens of the Moon. But like in that first book in particular, it's like there's all of these very almost obvious like flags or signposts that like, look, guys, Perrin's the hero.
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
he's not, right? And one of them is, that journey to the underworld that happens very, very early on, but also as you were mentioning, like the child, right? The naive point of view at the
Hmm.
start of the prologue, because in a lot of fantasy, it is about, as you say, discovering the world through the journey. And often that's done by starting with like someone young, someone rural, someone naive, someone who's not like experienced, might, be hidden royalty or something, but they start out from a place that was like lacking knowledge, right?
There's something really interesting, and maybe this is slightly skewing off from the point of death, but as we're talking about that introduction, you've just reminded me of something because the way that in that introduction, Paran introduces himself to Whiskey Jack, he says, "I want to be a hero." He says it explicitly, "I want to be a hero," and Whiskey Jack's response is, "Okay, you'll grow out of it." The last we hear of, slight spoilers for The God Is Not Willing, having said that we wouldn't touch any other books. The only mention we get of Paran, as far as I can tell, and it's been a while, in The God Is Not Willing, of Paran is what he calls himself. He calls himself twice alive, god of divination, master of the dead. So it's almost as though he gives himself this kind of heroic title at the start. And he's also actually one of the few people who climbs that ladder. I mean, there's a difference between gods and heroes and masters, but there is a
Yes.
sense in which he has almost climbed the ladder he wants to. He has reached a level of power that he was very naively wanting to attain at the start. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of complexity here, I think, as well. That on the one hand, Erikson is very much saying, "Look how naive this young man is," but at the same time, there does seem to be a level of power scaling and a genuine sense of heroism in the text.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I mean, I completely forgot that about the guy's not willing. So thank
yeah,
you for mentioning that and bringing that up. I have to revisit that for sure.
mhm,
Before the second book comes out. But I mean, I think what's interesting and sort of what you're getting at is that like what Erickson's doing is like making us think something's coming and then making us question whether it's
yes,
coming and then bringing it, but in a way that you didn't expect him to do it,
yes,
right? Like that's, I think,
yeah,
what is so interesting about Paran's journey is that like the elements are all there, but not in the way you expect them and certainly not in the order you'd expect them as
yes,
well. Because one of the things about the hero, and this is Palmer-Patel again, is that one of the important things with epic heroic fantasy is that the hero does power scale. Like the hero does come to some sort of, like, not necessarily a god, but some sort of closer connection to supernatural power through like their journey.
mhm.
So they do become more than human through the course of their work, their thing. And I guess at the end, and I'm gonna have to think about this, but like Paran has fully adopted that if he's the one like calling him that, whereas early on he's just like, no, that's not what I want.
So there's also a level of abstraction when you reach that power level. I mean, this happens with a few different characters in Malazan. The more powerful they are, the more distance they get from, their acquaintances at the beginning, and the more distanced they get from the reader. I think Paran is one example of that, that as he kind of begins to get increasingly powerful, we do take steps back from him. And I think the same thing happens going back to the discussion of death as well. That when these heroes come onto the page, when they're described as heroes, it's because they've died. And so almost in the act of becoming heroic, they've become inaccessible to us at the same time. So it's almost, at least to my reading, that when a character, and I want to be careful here because there's a difference between heroism and being a hero. Hero is a
Yep.
label, and being heroic and having heroism is a quality. But as they get described as heroes, it's almost as if they're taken away from us at the same time. Was something that I was thinking about as I was kind of thinking about this discussion.
Mhm. It's
I
like
don't know if you'd agree
they
with that or not. Yeah.
well, I'm trying to think about it. Because it does sort of seem, I like the idea, like in one sense, the post-death sort of label of hero acts almost as monument, right? So
Yes.
it's about memory, it's about how particular people are remembered. But I liked what you said in terms of like as things are taken away from the readers, because I think to switch characters for a moment, right?
Mm.
Two of the characters that I think actually most clearly fit the definition of like heroic epic fantasy hero are characters we don't get POVs from, like are Coltaine and Tavore,
Yes. Yeah.
right? So like even the ones where I think they very, at least a lot more clearly fit what we think of as heroes in terms of heroic qualities and that sort of heroic journey. And I don't want to lean too much on that because it comes from Joseph Campbell and there's some real problems with Joseph Campbell's theory of that.
Can
That
I interrupt you
idea.
very quickly
Oh
to
yeah, of
say
course.
that can you please give me all of these text recommendations after the call because I'm
Yes, yeah,
fascinated.
of
Every time you bring
course.
them up, I'm fascinated. So sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, sorry about that. And it's just it's habit, I guess, in terms of like I always want to like recognize where my ideas are coming from as opposed to being like yeah.
Mhm.
But the idea being that sort of these qualities that we recognize in a hero and in a heroic journey are in these characters that we don't have access to. And I still don't know exactly what to do with that, but I think it's really important,
Mhm.
right? That we don't, because both Coltaine, we know a little bit of this, but we definitely know this about Tavore. From the start, she chooses her sacrifice,
Mhm.
right? Like she knows what she has to do. And it's not just hers. She happily like sacrifices army,
Hmm.
basically, right? So she's
Hmm.
like put herself in a position to not just sacrifice herself, but like sort of almost act for others for the good of what she has sort of seen and agreed with. Of course, there's other gods and ascendants behind the scenes in this, but agreed for like the good of the world, right? Even though it's this just harrowing journey across, what is it, the Desert of Glass? Is that what it's called?
I think so. We'll check later to
Yeah.
make sure we're not tripping over any glass. But I find that really interesting with Tavore. And I also think as well, it does, and you mentioned this yourself, it comes back to that idea of being given, like, the divinity giving you your destiny, because it's very ambiguous with Tavore, isn't it? There are hints that she's working with potentially Cotillion and Shadow Throne to kind of get this outcome going, but it's left deliberately. And I love this, so ambiguous as to whether that's a partnership, as to whether that's some act of worship, perhaps, or whether that's even her taking the jump and going beyond and bringing them in a little bit as they have their own gambit. So that open question as to destiny and what is, how much of this destiny has been given to Tavore and how much she's acting on it. And I would argue as well, maybe one of the central heroes of the text is left very vague. And I love that Erikson doesn't wrap that up whatsoever.
I think it links to what you were saying about sort of the post-death hero in the sense that a lot of what I'm seeing with how Erikson treats heroes and writes heroes is that distance, right? Is that
Mm.
they can't, it's almost like it's pushing against our society's perhaps overuse of the term hero, just in sort of common day-to-day parlance. Like it doesn't seem to take much to call someone a hero, like maybe
Hmm.
saving puppies from a stream or something, which I
Hmm.
agree is a very good quality. I don't know if I'd call it a heroic act, per se.
How deep's the stream, I guess, is the question. Yeah.
How much are you sacrificing and doing? Yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
But that idea that like heroes are, because like contrast it with the Malazan Marines, I guess, is just think of like the point that I'm trying to get at, I guess. Because like the idea is certainly they're necessary for the outcome of this series and for sort of what happens, but they're all, they're grumpy. They're not exact. Like some of them really enjoy killing in very disturbing ways. Like they're not exactly heroes, and they're sort of the day-to-day individuals versus
Mhm.
the heroes who are kept distant, right? And I don't think that's to like hold Tavore over someone like Fiddler. I think Fiddler's the perfect example because we all love Fiddler.
Mm.
But it's just to sort of show that those are two different things, both of which are necessary but shouldn't be collapsed, if that
And
makes
also
sense.
going back to the idea of destiny, it's almost like Tavor is giving these soldiers their destiny. So there's almost a stratification here.
Mhm.
How would just to make sure that my own thought process are clear here, you said there's a distinction that shouldn't be collapsed. What for you is the distinction between Tavor and the kind of the grunt soldiers? Is it the ability to choose for themselves? Is that fair?
I mean, that's part of it,
Yeah.
right? Because like when you're in the military sort of structure and hierarchy, I mean, you can choose such that you could choose to be a deserter versus, be
Hmm.
part of that hierarchy. But it also, I think, has to do with, and maybe in this quality, Fiddler would be the wrong choice to think about this, but it does have to do with sort of like leaders versus those who do the work,
Hmm.
right? And then the real necessity of having both, right? Because like if Tafore didn't have the army following her, she wouldn't be able to have had the impact that she had. But they needed her to make those decisions based, yeah, possibly. That's what I love about her. Because yes, there's this hints of Cotillion and Shadow Throne, and I think that is a very valid way of thinking about it, but as you say, kept ambiguous. But
Hmm.
we like she's been driven since she was a child. Like she's
Yes.
always, it seems, had this sense, like why else would she be studying all of these military histories and all of these things if she didn't have this deep set early sense of her place in the universe and her eventual destiny that she would need that knowledge and need sort of that. So she's really interesting because like Gandalf sort of wishes to be a hero and Tavor quietly does it.
This is something I wrote down at the beginning as well, and when we were first kind of mapping out this discussion, is the idea of groups and peoples as heroes versus individuals, which is kind of what you're saying as well. And I was kind of thinking about this and the idea that the bone hunters maybe themselves perhaps form and kind of follow a hero's journey. They start off as quite naive and kind of cobbled together in one location, sort of looking about, not quite sure what's going on. And by the end of the, they follow this leader who they're not quite sure. I guess you could also even call him maybe a mentor figure. I don't know. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but also it's the army themselves that go through this sacrifice at the end. And I think very few of the bone hunters are left by the end. I think we forget like there's only like I think like double digits of bone hunters left by the end, and they're the ones who make the sacrifice to save the world. But I think this opens up another question because a lot of the bone hunters and this is not necessarily a quibble with the text, but it's certainly an interesting choice. The bone hunters don't know what's going on for 90 like until the very end of the crippled god. They're still like, why are we doing this again? We'll keep trusting her. We're not sure why, but we'll keep on going. And one thing I've got a quotation here from Brees Benedict, who says this to Fiddler, and I believe it's in Dust of Dreams, but I would need to double check that. Fiddler says they're talking about heroes and what it means to be a hero and the heroes who stand in the middle and defend everyone. And Fiddler just says, I don't really care about the issue of heroes. He says, when you're near your end, you stand by your convictions. And this is a quote. And that may or may not be heroic, but it's honest. And I think this opens up a really interesting question of heroism is not the important point here. It's whether or not you're following what you believe to be true. That is where true heroism comes from. It's not from the name hero. It's from whether you're going to quietly commit to what you view as important to you. And I think this is a really interesting open question in the case of the bone hunters, because number one, they're not really sure what their convictions are, other than following Tavore. And second of all, I mean, it's a bit of it's said all the time, that part of what Malazan Book of the Fallen does is it tries to untangle that word certainty and, the being cautious of being over certain about what you believe and how that can be a pitfall. So I'm not sure if this is really a question or just kind of a tangle of thoughts, but I find the Bone Hunters a really interesting example of what heroism might or might not be, because on the one hand, they have convictions, on the other hand, they don't. And they're willing to sacrifice, but they're not always sure what they sacrifice for. So I open those thoughts up to you, Erin, for comment, but I'm not sure if they make any kind of coherence.
No, I think they totally do. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because I think you're right in that it's one of the things I really like about what Erik's doing in the Book of the Fallen is that it's not just about individuals, it is also about these groups, right? And I think you can absolutely think of the Bone Hunters as on this type of sort of heroic journey structure, particularly like they even have their journey to the underworld with Yucatan,
Yes,
right? And they
yes,
come they
yes.
come back from death, right? Sort of, or at least a section, an important sort of group of them come back after being buried beneath the city. And so like absolutely that's intentional, right? That they're in conversation with that. But you're right. They've just, and maybe this is part of it, they have, despite the fact that we get many passages, the one that's bringing to mind is one between Callum and Quick Bend for me, but where there's this sort of like, are we following Tavore? Should we follow Tavore? Do you trust
Mhm.
her? I don't know. Like, are you going to be with her sort of deal? But then they follow, right? Like they do follow her even with that, even not knowing, even with her not giving them anything. And so there is that sense of they're in that journey. They don't have the agency, but they have the agency in the sense that they've brought it together with their own truth about their role in the Malazan Marines, right? So like I like your idea about the conviction, the quote you just gave. And I feel like there's another moment, and I don't remember what it is, unfortunately, but where it's talking about sort of the role of the Marine. All they really care about is guarding the back of the person beside them,
Mhm.
right? Like it's about their role. So, Tavore gets to think about the big picture. They basically guard their companions, right? So you have this wonderful idea of like the importance of both like a communitarian point of view and a like individualistic like leader point of view, and those actually working together in a way that's like messy,
Mhm.
but is what is required, right? To actually bring us to a point where, of course, the to put it in fantasy terms, the world is brought back into a certain type of balance, right? When you
Mhm.
have the death slash release of the cripple god, right?
I think it's interesting as well, just you're talking about the conviction of the soldier being to guard the person next to them and that being their choice. Because it also goes back to what you were saying in the beginning about Paran and whether or not he's going to take up this destiny and to what extent does he have agency within this call of destiny. And there's also an echo of that in what the Bone Hunters are going through. They have this call of destiny from Tavore, and they have to kind of juggle that and decide how they're going to address that. So no, I really loved what you were saying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and actually going back to Paran is really interesting because it's his choice, right, to bring the House of Chains into the deck because no one wants him to do it for the most
Hmm.
part. Like everyone thinks this is a really bad idea. And this is one of those moments where you actually get Ganos making a choice as opposed to, just being thrust into these different roles. Like in this moment, he makes the choice, yes, we're bringing the House of Chains in. And for some reason, my mind is connecting that to the Marines and whether we're talking about the bridge burners or the bone hunters, in the sense that it's about understanding that there's a certain power to be had when someone is incorporated in the system and sort of accepts their role in the system,
Hmm. And maybe
if
you could
that
say
makes
that
sense.
I'm just thinking about that in relation to our discussion on death as well, and how everything sort of feeds into these structures and systems. Because when you die, spoiler alert, you don't have much control of what happens to you afterwards. Um, and it's interesting thinking because I'm now thinking about our earlier kind of reference to Tavore and Coltaine, and I'm now thinking about Coltaine. Because once Coltaine dies, what happens to him? His personality, his deeds become the kind of focus of a power struggle between the Malazans and the Seven Cities continent about who owns this hero. And ultimately, the Malazan, or at least Lacine, decides to give him up and kind of go and do nasty things instead. But at the very start, I think it's of the Bone Hunters. It might be House of Chains, where they're selling trinkets from Coltaine's march, and there's various shrines going up to Coltaine's march. And someone says the line, "But hang on, he's our hero. He saved us." Um, and I really love this idea of people grappling and kind of trying to integrate various figures from history into their own kind of system, into their own government or whatever the process is to for their own benefits and desires. So I think there's maybe a conversation to be had there. But yeah, I
Mhm.
totally resonate with what you're saying.
Yeah, and the idea of who owns the hero, I love that because it's about the narratives that power
Yes.
creates, right? Which like
Mhm.
Lacine is certainly trying to do, but not doing it very well, frankly. If we're talking about the scene, propaganda doesn't really seem to be her strong point. Because
Malik
that
Rel,
complete,
Malik Rel it is. Yeah.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
Malik Rhule, absolutely. That's, why he wins
Yes.
ultimately in that power struggle. To bring us back to the hero figure, one of the reasons that heroes are mythic is because they are figures and stories that are used for these particular ends, like once
Yes.
once they're gone. And I find it Coltine is interesting to me too, because like remind me about this if I'm wrong, but because we have the sense, of course, that the crows were actually able to get to him to take his soul. And
Hmm.
I really expected him to come back in a very material way. And there's like glimpses, but he never really does, as far as I
Not in the Malazan
remember.
Book of the Fallen. He
Yeah.
does appear in Return of the Crimson Guard. Is that spoiler? You can cut this.
Okay.
He is on the page in Return of the Crimson
Okay.
Guard. Yeah. You know, it's interesting just this discussion about using dead heroes to frame our broader cultural narratives. Because one thing, can I just spoil exactly what I did? I know I've already told you. When I knew we were having this discussion, I literally went through all my Kindle copies of Malazan Book of the Fallen and typed in the word hero into the search bar and just looked through how these terms were coming up and how they were used. And in some ways that is a flawed thing to do because you can have aspects of heroism without ever mentioning the word hero. And also it exposes you to words like treacherous and Carther on crust, which have the word hero inside them and it skews up the data. But it was a very interesting thing to do. And one person that I was not expecting to have the word hero ascribed to over and over. Well, there's two. There's Karsa and there's Rhulad Sengar. And Rhulad Sengar is a really interesting case in point, if you don't mind me bringing him up, because I think he's pertinent to this
Yeah.
discussion. In in Midnight Tides, Rhulad dies. Yeah. And actually descends to the underworld and comes back. There is kind of an inversion of the hero's journey there, or kind of a parodic version of the hero's journey. But he is referenced as a hero in that section of Midnight Tides three times. And every time it's by Fear Sengar. Well, it's twice by Fear Sengar, and once it's Thrall saying to Fear, "Why do you keep calling your dead brother a hero?" Because that's what Fear does. He keeps saying he's going to get a hero's funeral. He died as a hero. This is really important to Fear, and I think it really exposes something about Fear because he has this younger brother who is a bit off the rails, who is very selfish and narcissistic and wants what fear has. And there's clearly a tension between these brothers. But as soon as Rhulad dies, the first thing that fear does is he almost twists and maybe that's a mean word to use towards fear, but we all do this about people
Yeah.
who've died. We change that image so we can fit it in our head in a way that's palatable. And I think very much fear is doing that with Rhulad. But of course it's that funerals. I'm not just rambling, forgive me, but it's now that funerals, like hero's funeral that fear gives Rhulad, sticking the coins on him all over the place, that leads to his greater disfigurement and his agony when he does come back. At least in my reading, it almost seems to be Erikson pointing towards this lionization of very human people who've died, and pointing out the ways that that is incongruent with the reality that preceded it. And I don't know what you would think about that, Aaron.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to address that because I do think you're right, and it is interesting that it's that initial death, right? Where Fear is talking about him as hero. And there's a sense that it's because, they had this mission from the leader of their society. And even though what we've got of Rhulad is that he's a sort of reckless, jealous, kid, a typical adolescent at this
Mm,
point, like the idea that he I forget what it was, but he was actually sort of guarding their backs, right? And had killed numerous things. That's because Troll thought that he, had run away. And Fear's like, no, he actually,
hmm
I killed. And he grabbed the sword because he had to, right? It was part of the battle. It wasn't this attempt for glory or whatnot. It is absolutely like a sort of revising of who he is, but also a recognition of the fact that he was acting at least in the what they think is the higher goals of the community, right? If
hmm
we're because it's still the Warlock King, right, at this point, and
hmm
who wanted the sword and who sent them to get the sword. So there is that element of yes, it's retrospect, but also he's justifying it because of those actions. And just meaning it in a like a one heroic stand, like not a hero's journey way. But you're right, because it gets turned into a hero's journey
Yes.
because he dies and he comes back. And and I love that Erikson does this because it's something, it's so overdetermined and it's painful because of that. I feel like it's because there was so much Marxism in the air when he was like doing his university training and whatnot. But like, this idea of he doesn't just come back once. Like he
hmm
dies over and over and over and over again. And it's almost like he's showing us the grotesque pain of being thrust into this hero role. It's
Oh, I
almost to
love
be
that.
careful what
Yeah.
you wish for,
Yeah.
right? And we got that a bit with Ganos and the pain of becoming the master of the deck, but we really get it with Rhulad, who, as a kid, wanted to be a hero like his brothers. And what he gets is just horrifying, frankly, made worse, you're totally right, by this sort of hero's funeral. So he now has these quains, and like it's always this idea that it's like very painful, and occasionally they're falling out, and
Yep.
he heals, but he still goes through all the pain. Like it's actually a horrific curse that like the cripple god has put upon him
Yeah.
in this way. But he does fulfill some of those qualities of hero,
Yeah.
interestingly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Oh, I loved what you were saying there about that, the rebirth and all of that. I mean, it's interesting that he is such a focal point of that word hero as I was doing my kind of lexical, don't even want to call it analysis, just control Fing. I'm going to be, he came up a lot. And actually, just to follow this up about the lionization of people who have passed away, when Fear himself dies, Onrak tells Trull. And the words he uses are very, very similar. And I wish I'd written them down, but it's very much like your brother died as a hero. He died a hero's death, and we're going to honor that. There's a real echo between those two books that I never would have caught.
I mean, I want to say two things because one, that like don't belittle the control F motive research and analysis because like I don't know, this is probably way before your time in terms of like academics and whatnot, but like that was a big thing. Like I don't know if you've ever heard of concordances.
Yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right, like people
yeah.
made concordances of Shakespeare, of like all these major figures of like James Joyce's Ulysses, and pre-control F they actually sat down and literally counted words, which is wild.
Yes.
That people did this. I imagine they had very big budgets for research assistants. But it's like I think that sort of like word patterning and studying that, I love that we have ebooks now because it actually makes it's still annoying, but it's much easier to do. And I think it gives the types of insights that you can't notice just from
Yeah, I've
reading
never
like
noticed
back
that
to
otherwise.
front.
Yeah.
Right? Like I would never have thought of hero in relation to Rhulad had you not like done those searches and brought that up.
It's interesting to talk about kind of Reaper's Gale and this kind of section of the series. First of all, thank you for validating the Control F. Makes me feel much better. I actually want to get the whole Malazan Book of the Fallen and to have that as one Kindle file because it's quite annoying having to go through different copies. But what I also noticed doing this process was something quite and please stop me if I digress too much or go or speak too long. But doing this as a 10-book process was really fascinating for me. And again, you're missing out excerpts of heroism where the word hero is not mentioned, so it's very much flawed. In Gardens of the Moon and Dead House Gates, I believe in each book the word hero or heroism or heroic is only mentioned 5 or 6 times at most. And all of those are bar one or two, are very cynical sentences. It's kind of saying the word hero is defunct and outmoded and idealistic. And one thing I love about Malazan Book of the Fallen is how actually quite hopeful it is. And what I noticed going through this process, when you get to Reaper's Gale and Toll the Hounds, you still have those cynical, yeah, the heroic last stand when really it's just cannon fodder, those kind of examples, or the heroes of the past. There's a really good line in one of the poems where all we have of the heroes of the past is the hollow iron ring of their names. It's something like that. So that cynicism is still there and that skepticism is still there. But what I noticed going through all the kind of instances of the word hero or the STEM hero, there's actually, as you go through the series, a lot more validation of that word hero as you continue. There were instances, at least to my reading of the text, where Erikson or the character whose POV you are from does seem to validate that actually, yes, that person was a real hero. And I've kind of got two examples that really stood out to me. The first one is Beak. Beak says in one passage, I want to be a hero like the others, something like that. I wish I'd written it down. And then after Beak dies, someone does look down from the walls, and there's a slight touch of cynicism here because he's pointing out the fact that Beak has died, but he also does say, yes, and there is a hero who is no longer with us. And there does seem to be a sense in which, yes, he really was what he wanted to be. Contrast that with Paran at the start, who wants to be a hero, and Whiskey Jack basically slaps him down. It's very different. And the other one, I don't know if you remember, and I'm blanking on the name. I think it's Bellum Nom, one of the lesser known gnomes, right? We've got
Okay.
Torvald Nom, we've got Ralik Nom, and then we've got I think it's Bellum, but I will check that and I will post a comment doing a mea culpa if I'm wrong. Um, in fact, no, I have the quotation because Bellum Nom is one of the students. He's a teenager. He's one of the students in the sword training arena that has been
Okay.
set
Yep.
up in Darugistan. And he goes out to try and save Harlow, if I'm not mistaken. And again, commenters, you can tell me if I'm off here. But I wrote down this quotation as I was sifting through and trying to get a little bit of context, but mainly it was a bigger, broader project. This is a really interesting quotation. So this is what Krupp, I think it's Krupp's POV, that broader kind of POV, is saying about Bellum Nom as he heads out to look for Harlow. And this strikes me as quite sincere. I could be wrong. Mark him well. These are the thoughts of courage, unquestioning and uncompromising, and this is how heroes come to be. Small ones, big ones, all kinds. When drama arrives, they are there. Look out, see for yourself. And what I loved about doing this process that we can talk about, we can move on to other stuff, is that it really did expose to me that in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, as we get towards the finish line, there does seem to be a slight more opening of the reality of heroism, that it's not something that we might just have to cynically eschew because we're all kind of adults and grown up and much more clever. And I love that in the context of Malazan, because Malazan, as Erikson has said many times himself, is not grimdark. It's not ultimately cynical. There is a strain of hopefulness that carries right through to the end. And I think by doing this exploration of the letters HERO, you can also see that grounded as the series progresses. It was a wonderful little exercise to do at midnight. I won't lie.
I wanted to actually jump on what you're saying in terms of, because I think that one of the common threads there is sacrifice,
Mm,
right? And I think you're right. And because Krupp, I think Krupp is actually like, yes, he's a fool. yes, there's a lot of sort of in the same way you see with like Shakespeare's fools, there's it's very difficult to pin down how you're supposed to take the tone often of what he's
Hmm.
saying, but often is speaking truth through misdirection, right?
Hmm.
Like sort of a Shakespearean fool. But I think he is being quite sincere in that moment because it is, and we see this with Beak, we see it in that moment, we see it with Murillo, who breaks my heart. We see it like in various other places, but it's also about the Marine standing next to the other Marine. It's about that moment of sacrificing the self for others, right? And Beak it Beak breaks everyone's heart except
Mm.
one mod on the Malazan subreddit who is wrong, frankly. But yeah, because like I love Beak because you get to see him actually get a sense of acceptance over the course of him working with like Faraday's sort, which I love because I hated her for killing the scorpion, right?
Mm.
But then have to come to like her for how she treats Beak and gives him that sense of family and his place within the unit. And so, like, showing how, like, bringing him into that community is in a large way what enables him to then utterly sacrifice himself to save those other people in a way that we don't really see any other magic users do. They may be powerful, but they stop right before their limit. And
Hmm.
he doesn't stop. Like he does this. And I think Hero in a completely non-cynical way, if there's one absolute genuine heroic moment in this text, it's that moment. Just even the like the purifying in weight, right? Like it's the pureness of his intentions. It's just purely about the love of the community that's accepted him. And it's like, I think it's a beautiful moment.
It goes back to what we were saying at the start, where kind of exposure to the world is what makes the hero feel able to sacrifice themselves. That knowledge is what allows for that sacrifice. It's also making me think of the discussion we did with Malazan Hot Takes, with the few other people when you talked about the animals in Malazan.
Yeah.
And oh my goodness, Benton Roach, is that right?
Yep.
Roach is also from The Witcher, so I was scared I got that wrong. Um, those two animals also, to an extent, come to a larger knowledge of the world through their relationship with Stormy and Gessler and the Bone Hunters, and that I think is at that climactic moment. Another example of sacrifice for the person next to you.
Yep.
I think it's their knowledge of their comrades is what leads to that really nice but nasty moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
but there's
But
also,
it's
if I can just add in one more
okay.
point,
No,
that
please do.
Kofian is also the major point of sacrifice in Malazan Book of the Fallen, and that one is slightly more problematic because he becomes the Redeemer, and that's questioned itself in Told the Hound. So it's a really interesting issue.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I think actually that's a perfect thing to bring up because so the Jacobian one, which in his own sort of sacrifice, sure, it's ill-timed. We can acknowledge that. But it is this incredible, taking on of burden and pain to alleviate the pain of an entire people, basically, whether they deserve that. But that's the point. It's not about desert, right? It's about
Hmm.
just that just pure compassion almost. But it is problematized by his sort of being turned into the Redeemer, but that's the fault of the worshipers, right?
Mm.
So I think that's what's really interesting when we were thinking about like how heroes are used and in terms of propaganda. That's another way that that's being explored is the way that the worshipers shape gods, right? In this
Hmm.
series, right? And you see that in really like inopportune moments, like say with Mael, him being sort of brought down
Yes.
because someone has spilled blood on an old altar, and so he can't sort of immediately say Tehol and Jeneth. And you see it in other moments where like Erastus is being shaped by Featherwitch. So like that element of the way the worshippers are shaping the gods. And so almost what's being played with there too is the ways that in retrospectively like shaping the heroes, we're losing what was actually heroic about them in
Hmm.
important ways, right? Like we just have the Redeemer, but that has become something almost sort of petty and selfish
Hmm.
in the ways that it's taken up.
There's a really interesting. There's in fact there's a lot of ekphrasis is the talking of art in a text. That's correct, right? I'm
Mhm.
going to
Well,
say
it's just
yeah.
a description of art, of a piece of
There,
art in a
there's
text.
lots of it and I think it's in Carcanis too, but I didn't go into Carcanis, the representation of heroes in artwork and how they're described and how they're brought forth. And also not beyond that, there's also lots of just kind of artistic language used to describe how heroes are constructed. I've got a quotation written down here that I think comes from Dust Dreams of the Crippled God. It took 1,000 eyes to weave a hero. I've got one from House of Chains. Words that clothe a Templar in a hero's garb. The idea that a hero is something kind of constructed that we then apply to ourselves. And I love how, because a lot of this is from Karsa actually, when he talks about the heroes and the gods above him, because they're kind of intertwined.
Yeah,
All the figures from his past that he feels like he needs to match to become a war leader or a hero in his own mind. I love where we land with Karsa at the end of the Crippled God. Someone says to Karsa in
that's
the
fine.
Crippled God in that one little scene that he's in, and someone says to him, "Have you not seen the heroic statues that line our city?" And he goes something like, "Yes, I see how the birds shit on them," um, which I think is brilliant because so much of the Malazan Book of the Fallen and Carcanis is people looking at these big, beautiful heroes that came before, but they're not the heroes that came before, as you said. They are the symbols that we create to justify what we're doing. And I love that although Karsa is such a problematic character, part of his journey was, I mean, House of Chains, I mean, in the sense of chain, he was chained to the people that came before him because he wanted to match and exceed them. And I love that at the end of the Crippled God, he is able to just say, no, I am who I am, and I'm not beholden to anyone that comes before me. So yeah, that's what was going in my mind as you were chatting about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and wildly resisting. I mean, one of the things I really like about Karsa is that even more than Ganos, like he resists what people are thrusting upon him, right? Like
Yeah.
he resists being sort of brought into the crippled gods pantheon. He resists that sort of legacy of like what he was raised at least to believe that his like Toblikai should be, should do, should act. He of course throws off all of civilization, or at least is attempting to, and is
Hmm.
certainly being resisting being made a god,
Hmm.
right? So like all of this, which I don't think is heroic, but is also something really interesting, right? Because he's also just resisting the idea, I think, of being made a hero. And it's the made, as you say, is the important sort of part of that, which is what I think it brings us back to. Like, this is why so many of these beautiful moments in the text are about these pure sacrifices that aren't part of this big complex journey, right? So
Hmm.
they aren't made into like the large epic journey. It's just because like we get Beak in one book,
Yes. And
right? Like we,
a sliver of that book as well. He's
yeah.
not paid very much. Yeah.
And we get like even these moments with particular soldiers or whatnot, or again with the dogs. Yes, the dogs span most of the series, but like you could probably fit on 2 pages all of their scenes, right? Like it's very, very light sprinkling throughout. It takes a fairly obsessed with animals mind to actually notice that sort of thing, as I learned in our conversation. But it's so I think what we're going to keep coming back to, but I think in really interesting ways, is the ways that the series, because I would call it actually a heroic epic series. I absolutely think it is, but it's just never a singular hero. And the hero is often not linked to the epic, if that makes sense, right? Like a lot of those epic
Mhm.
qualities are with like Paran or whatnot, but the heroes are Beak, right? So like
Do you
the
know?
heroes and the sacrifice.
Do you know what I was written down squint? That may be a good example of this. And the line is heroism and murder in a single gesture. When he's the one who puts the arrow through Coltaine.
Yeah.
I mean, Squint barely shows up, and I think when he shows up in the next book, he's properly harrowed by what he's done, and it takes Fiddler to sort of source him out. But he's barely on the page, and the word I was going to say the word commits, but I mean commits murder. It has connotations. His act is one of the most heroic acts in the book because he's the one who has to shoulder that burden if we're going to go back to it, Covian,
Yeah.
and do the hard thing that needs done. You know, I love what you were saying. One thing I wrote down on the bottom of my Google Doc is in my reading, Erikson doesn't believe in heroes, but he does believe in heroism.
Yeah.
And that's sort of where I'm tending to land with a lot of these kind of conversations we're having because, again, it's the low key, small, not necessarily small. How can we put it? Actions without expectation of glory,
Yeah.
actions without expectation of reward. And that maybe goes back to the whole concept in Malazan of being witnessed versus unwitnessed. I mean, often the most heroic gestures are not ones that are ever going to be witnessed. I don't think anyone actually makes out of the crippled god knowing what the dogs have done. It's given to us on the page, but it's never actually celebrated by anyone after that.
Well, that's why it needs the in-world author to be the one who wrote it,
Yes.
right? Because the only one that witnessed it, like, if we're going with the idea that in some ways, right, it's like Camazod who has written this
Hmm.
entire book, it requires that God's eye view. That was the only sort of witness to it,
Hmm.
in terms of what they've done. There's actually a really great academic paper by Peter Melville, which again I'll link below,
Hmm.
on unwitnessed versus witness, and it's very much about Tavore, and her commitment to an unwitnessed heroism and just sort of the moral qualities of that, and the moral stakes involved in it. And it's that does very much get where we're getting to, in the sense that it's about that present without any thought to one's own futurity, right? Because
Hmm.
when you think about someone wanting to be hero, they're like, I want to live, I want my name to live on. I want to be narrativized. I want to be in Fisher Kiltath's poems, like I want to be that larger than life figure. And it's, I think you're right in the sense that, yes, that is the hero, and we're not going to escape the fact that this is how our society defines and constructs hero.
Hmm.
But heroism in the active verbal sense is not to do with any of those things. And the notion of being unwitnessed takes that to its utter extreme, right? Because at least, what Beak does is witnessed and will be, talked about. And it's not why Beak does it, but it is clearly something that an act that lives on, even on the bodies for a while of everyone who was there, right? And that they're all bleached white, although that starts to fade, I think, by the final books. But yeah, that when Tavor is bringing that army and they're all following her, like, no one will know of our sacrifice, but that in no way changes, right? The fact that this is an essential thing to do. And so it gets to, I guess, again, the point of, almost, if you're unwitnessed, it's a much purer act because no one can manipulate it, right? Like, no one can change it the way they do with Eccovian, for
Hmm.
instance.
You're making me think of all people, Felicin. And let me explain why. And this might come out half-baked, and if so, please cut it. But if you're still listening, dear viewer, then you know that I've made some kind of sense. Because, well, here's my thought process here. I was thinking about there's a couple of lines about heroism in Malazan regarding the fact that heroes often their heroism or their heroic act, if we want to differentiate it from the word heroism, but their act of trying to be a hero actually leads to destruction, right? And then there's a line about a hero, gallivanting through a city and actually bringing disease and actually causing a huge amount of hurt through his desire to be like this gallant human being. And also interesting how we often associate that word hero with men as well, and handsome cavalier men, but that's kind of something that comes from just all the stuff that has accumulated in our cultures. Um, when Paran dies and he descends to hell, I don't know if you recall what Hood says or Hood's messenger says. If we bring him back, we're going to take someone else.
Yep.
And I did a little bit of digging on the wiki, and apparently Erikson has said since in an interview that, and I'll need to follow this up, the person who dies senselessly because of Paran's coming back is Felicin. I don't know if you're aware of that. I wasn't
Yep.
aware of that. And I love that because one of the tragedies of Felicin's death is that it feels so purposeless. There is no, she is witnessed, but there is no sacrifice or good to come out of her perishing. So Paran to some extent does get to be a hero and become the master of divination, god of the deck, but part of the destruction that happens as a result of that heroism is this pure I don't even know how to articulate it, like traumatized character who seemed very innocent when we see her very briefly in Gardens of the Moon, not just turned into something that is heavy and weighted down with everything that she has experienced, but also her death is fundamentally brings no I don't know how to articulate it, but there are no good ramifications to it. It feels the most purposeless death, apart from maybe Troll. So when we're thinking about this idea of heroism and bringing positivity, Paran's coming back from continuing his hero's journey actually causes a lot of purposeless destruction on another front. Was that good
Well, and
enough to
it's,
keep in? You can tell me.
yeah, no. I think that's a really interesting point. And yeah, I've read that theory. I mean, I wasn't
Yeah.
aware that Erikson had endorsed it himself.
Hmm.
But I definitely read the theory that that was the person being referred to. But I don't remember it's which part of Opon says that.
Hmm.
But there is that sense that if Paran goes back, someone else is going to be taken in his place. And of course, both of our, to go on a tangent myself, I think it's interesting that both of our really just random, feels very unfulfilling deaths have to do with the characters associated with chance, right? Like it's Opon or
Mm.
Erastus, or the errant. So I think there's something going on there that's a total digression. But with Velison, I think it's not completely unwitnessed in that like Pearl and Lestariel, no, but that's pretty much
Hmm.
it, right? Like just them along with the reader, and they of course intentionally keep that away from Tavore. But you're right that there's this sense that in this sort of sibling, like this family of heroes, one of them has to be sacrificed for the other two siblings to take on the heroic roles. Because I don't think it's like it certainly starts as being to do with Paran, but I think it also has to do with Tavore and that victory, right? In that moment over the rebellion, which is quite empty and anticlimactic. And but it is about a sacrifice that we won't understand until much later, almost, it seems.
Yeah.
It's just sort of heartbreaking that it has to be like the youngest, sort of most innocent sister who is the one that all of this happens to. Because she's sacrificed by Tavore at the start by being sent to the Ototaro mines
Yes.
in the first place, right? So sort of inadvertently, not through his agency by Paran, and quite through her own agency by her older sister Tavore, she's set
Hmm.
up as the sacrifice that allows them to be heroes later on.
And I do like that. I was just trying to look up that passage, but I couldn't find it. I don't want to spend too much time. I also love that at the end of, and I believe it's their last scene, part the Tavora and Ganoes, the last moment we have with them. First of all, Tavora, if I recall correctly, lets out a really kind of just scream of anguish. And following that, she finds Paran and she says to him, "I lost her." And that's how we leave them. Is that kind of acute sense of what have we done, and that we have through some, again, I would argue legitimate heroism, especially on the part of Tavora, not to diminish Ganoes, but that's where it comes back to is some of the pain that we've left along the way. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm. There's, I wish I could remember it. There is, I was seeing it on the subreddit. There's a conversation about a comment, because in a weird way, this comes back to Paran, like Ganos Paran, as in some ways the central epic hero of this, strangely enough, in terms of
Mm,
just the structures we expect from that. Because there was someone who on the subreddit quoting Tavore talking about how like her whole journey began, or this whole thing began when Ganos left home, like
mm,
when he chose to join the military. And that actually almost set her on her road. So there is also like that, not the sense of Perrin being heroic, but the idea of him being almost the linchpin that's just because of destiny, because of these supernatural forces, is he can't help but pushing other people around him as he moves through the world and makes decisions, right? That idea of just, we don't get a lot of a sense of intrinsic destiny or fate in Erikson's series, but I think it's there with Perrin in really interesting, strange ways. And that's
mm.
one of them. That somehow his initial choice, his desire to be hero, actually is what at least Tavore claims is the thing that sets her off as well, which sets all of these other things in motion.
I didn't realize that she'd said that herself to Tavora in the text, that it was that made me head off. Is that, is
I will double check this
yeah.
like subreddit, but there was a great conversation on this post, like people talking that through, and it was something I hadn't noticed. I'm assuming it's in the ninth or tenth book, which I haven't reread yet. But
Hmm.
that idea of him being the reason that it all sort of, she at least started on the path she went
Not to
down.
not to hopscotch characters too much, but this talk of destiny and it's also making me think now going back to Karsa and the end of the crippled god, because what does he do? He inverts it and he if I recall correctly, literally destroys the shrapnel of Fenner right, people talk about the dinosaurs with swords as being the most heavy metal part of Malazan. No, mate, because at the end of that series, a character kills a god, blood literally rains down from the sky to reanimate zombies. I mean that is it.
It's
Um,
wild.
it's a great ending. But that meanwhile they're fighting on the top of a mountain and the dogs are jumping in and there's like cracks. So it's I love it. It's so apocalyptic that the final battle,
Yeah.
final battles I should say. But again, just talking about that idea of destiny, you're now making me realize that at the very end, what you have is that inversion of who controls who and for what purpose. But that is also muddied by the fact that we have Cotillion and Shadow thrown in the battle of the Holds versus the Warrens and that conversation as well. So yeah, I love how we keep the connections we make keep linking to other characters and facets of the text.
Mhm.
Um, I feel like we could do it forever.
Yeah, which we probably shouldn't because we're getting, but
Ten
no,
10-hour
it's
Malazan conversation. Let's do it.
start with book one and work our way through. No, but that is what I think is why this text generates so much discourse, generates so many
Hmm.
posts. Like, is it endlessly curious? People endlessly come back to like. There's people who've reread it like 10 times, which is wild. I wish I had the time to do that. Because there are all of these interconnections and complexities that you don't tend to get in more, not like, I don't want to say simplistics because it's absolutely not, but more straightforward heroic epic fantasies, right? That are more focused on, one group or one hero or whatnot.
Hmm.
And the fact that like Erikson does weave these themes and characters together in a way that makes it impossible to oversimplify is why I love it. Right? In
That
the
yeah.
sense that like we can't you can't say this is the hero. You can't say this is a heroic act. It's always, oh, okay, this is a heroic act, but or like, like there's always a qualifier, which I think is part of his point. There is no exception, maybe of Beak. There is no purity in human existence. Like it's
Hmm.
just not a thing.
Hmm. Except for me.
Sure.
I completely agree with what you're saying. I mean, this is going to sound very gushy and a bit too much, but I feel like we're at the tail end, so I can say
Yeah,
it
we're
because
coming at the end.
everyone who disagrees with us is gone, so it's fine. Erikson keeps talking about Malazan as a 3 million word short story, or at least he said that once as a quotation. This is where it sounds very gushy. I tend to think of it as a 3 million word poem. And I don't mean that to sound like, oh, it's the most beautiful, complex thing ever written, but I do think it allows for that cross comparison and the individual word choice and that kind of stuff, which I think is what Erikson is getting at when he says short story versus novel.
Yep.
But I do think the conversations that we're generating and the other people in the subreddit, those geniuses, those glossaries, those encyclopedias, tend to have, it's because there is so much unstitching we can do. And if I can continue that metaphor, like a tapestry, right? I mean, tapestries and friezes and things like that come up ad nauseum in Malazan,
Yep.
and in
Malazan.
Carcanis as well. I think they're quite prevalent
Yes.
there, and it's that idea of being able to visually kind of see these connections and put things together in such a way that do make this such a rewarding text, and why the maniacs read it 10 times. Although I'd love to be one of them one day, but I'm Scottish and
Yes,
my
yeah.
life expectancy is like 36, so
Oh, no. But yeah, no, I agree. And I don't think that's gushy at all. And besides, as you say, if there's people still here, they are
they
in
get
on the
it.
gushiness. But I think, I don't know, I feel like we've really covered a lot about heroes, heroism, the series, brought in lots of stuff. I'm super happy leaving us there, unless you have, I don't know, any final thoughts of like things you were dying, passages you were dying to read, things you were dying to mention.
I'm scrolling down my cheat sheet, and the only thing that I think I would have brought up, and we've already kind of discussed it in terms of, what the word hero means in Gardens versus Reapers, is also heroic last stands. I just add this as a final comment. In the first kind of
Yep.
5 books of Malazan Book of the Fallen, heroic last stands are always mentioned, or near always mentioned derisively. And then in the back half of the series, what do you have but a series of heroic last stands? And I find that very interesting as well. But I won't go into it too
Yep.
much, but I just wanted to bring up that point as maybe something to think about. But no, I've,
Well,
I've really enjoyed this conversation. Yeah.
I think it's a really point. And I actually want to comment one thing on that, which is not something I'd noticed, but like your use of the sort of concordance technique and that comment are making me think of it now. And I want to go back and think about it more at leisure. But this idea that we start throughout the series. Hi, Lana.
Yeah.
Um, My cat has told me it is time to stop. We start throughout the series in a very, very cynical frame that does, you're right, move to something like a lot more hopeful, a lot more positive. And I feel like that is interesting. And I wonder how intentional it is, or whether it just became a, like, as Erikson was writing,
Hmm.
it just had these qualities. Sorry, she is so distracting. Lana, don't knock down that screen.
That's the first hero treat right there.
Yeah, minus the stripes. She hasn't had fought a battle recently, so the stripes aren't
That
really
that you know
visible
of.
right now.
Yeah. It's interesting because
Um,
people talk about the growing complexity of the back half of the series and the
yes.
confusion, that it's more confusing and
But the
verbose and
tonal
philosophical.
shift
But
that
it's
you're
also
talking
more
about,
positive.
yeah,
I mean,
I think that's,
Dust of Dreams dips into a bit of an existential crisis, but it does so that you can then ride that high at the end. So, at least
yeah,
in my reading, yeah.
yeah. No, I think that that's fascinating, and I think that's good because it's like, as much as perhaps our, and I'm not going to say Erikson himself, but as much as perhaps our authorial voice wants to be cynical about the heroic epic narrative and the way that it's been treated, throughout history, they really want to be cynical about it. As they move through these stories, they just can't, because there
Hmm.
are, true, genuine moments that almost, like, I love that idea. Like, our narrator himself was pulled back from his cynicism
Hmm.
by witnessing
Hmm.
these acts,
Hmm.
right? So it's like this genuine thing that's, like, perhaps maybe hopefully reflecting what's happening with the readers as they read as well, in really
Absolutely.
neat ways.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a good place to start. In terms of, viewers, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the channel. I was supposed to say at the start, I never remember to. And thank you, David, so much for doing this. I love having these conversations because you're bringing stuff to me that I would never have thought of, and hopefully I've said a couple of things that
Likewise. Yeah.
were interesting to you. And yeah, I think this was great, and hopefully we have more discussions in the future.
I'd love to. Genuinely, sincerely. Yes, please.